Hello and welcome to Business Africa with me, Ronald Kato. This week, Electrifying Africa will report on how the pandemic had efforts to expand access to electricity, leaving hundreds of millions in the dark. We assess the interventions needed for the continent's energy security and reliability. Plus, does Africa have enough skilled people to fix mounting problems in agriculture, energy, and climate change? We examine why the continent needs to invest massively in the teaching of applied sciences, engineering, and technology. Also, a changing climate is driving up farm costs for Kenyan farmers. One of the main producers of Arabica coffee, unreliable weather has also affected bean quality. Stay with us for the details. Thank you for joining us. Africa is the least electrified continent. The COVID-19 pandemic has especially hurt progress towards universal energy access. While other regions saw their populations without electricity decline, Africa's went up. The continent needs to be spending at least $30 billion per year to achieve the UN goal of electricity for all by 2030.
The lack of adequate and reliable electricity remains one of the key factors holding back African economies. They are overlooked for investment and struggle to industrialize. And yet, the pandemic, with its attendant lockdowns, supply chain disruptions and diversion of fiscal resources by governments, did even further damage. According to the UN, COVID-19 has slowed progress towards universal access to electricity and clean cooking fuels and technology. Overall, nearly 600 million remain without access to electricity in Africa. Tunisia, Algeria, Ghana and South Africa remain frontrunners in electrification, while South Sudan, Chad, Central African Republic, Malawi and Niger lead with the lowest access to electricity. According to the report, Sub-Saharan Africa's share of the global population without electricity rose from 71% in 2018 to 77% in 2020. Most regions of the world saw declines. One of the factors preventing countries from expanding access is the cost. In Sub-Saharan Africa, achieving electrification for all would require investing at least $31 billion per year by 2030. For context, only $5 billion was received in 2017.
My guest is Jude Moore, Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development. He's also served as Liberia's Minister for Public Works. Thank you so much, sir, for your time. What investments are needed to expand access and where?
The best way to get electricity to people is with scale. That means the unit cost becomes cheaper the bigger the scale is. And the way we do it with scale is on the grid. But when you design a grid, the way to make the grid profitable, the way to make the project viable commercially is by having massive off-takers who consume energy in bulk. So we're talking about, metal smelters, factories, mines, large hospital complexes, people who use significant amounts of power. So these large off-takers end up giving you consistent cash flow so that you can be able to expand electricity access to smaller users, retail households. What has been missing in Africa, really, are these large off-takers, mines and factories. So if we're going to make any investment now, it has to be that. So one of the ways to do that, though, in African countries that export minerals, by bringing some of the value chain to Africa, by adding some value to the minerals, allows you to build out justifiably and be able to afford it, huge investment in energy, that then allows you to provide electricity to households. So there's that.
Jude, Africa is oil, gas, and coal rich. But how do we put all these, resources to use, plus renewables, of course, to put them into our energy mix to solve our energy poverty, whilst navigating these climate concerns?
My colleagues at the Energy for Growth Hub have done the assessment. And here it is. This is improbable, but think about it. That if 49 countries in Africa were to triple their energy use overnight using natural gas, the total contribution to global emissions will still be less than 1%. it would be 0.62%. So there is no viable future in which Africa's use of natural gas threatens emissions. In developed countries, here in the United States, in Europe, it is a very difficult thing to tell the voting public that we're going to cut emissions in a way that affects the economy. You're not going to get elected. But we know that emissions have to be cut. So instead of cutting emissions at the pace it should be cut domestically, you offshore that. You basically outsource that to us in Africa by saying, if Africans do not invest in fossil fuel assets, then we will be able to keep emissions down. But that comes at the cost of our development. So how is it Africa's responsibility to sacrifice its development so that the world will be able to respond to a climate crisis it did not cost? This question of what we do and how we can reconcile our development goals with the need to transition to net zero is that because Africa is historically almost negligible in its emissions, there is significant room then for us to use some fossil fuels even as we make the transition.
Jude, the U.S.-Africa summit just ended, and there's a U.S. initiative called Power Africa. It's been around for some time. How can efforts such as these be ramped up to have a bigger effect on electrification rates on the continent?
Power Africa is a very, very important initiative, but it's going to take more than Power Africa to be able to close the gap that we're talking about. 600 million is a very, very big number. And you know, because of the COVID crisis, a lot of infrastructure projects were stalled. A lot of infrastructure projects were not invested in because governments needed to support livelihoods and the economies. And so it meant that, you know, the numbers of those without access to electricity has either not shifted or gotten worse.
Jude Moore, thank you so much for your time.
It's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for having me.
Universities in Africa are struggling to produce graduates with the skills and competences, especially in applied sciences, engineering, and technology subjects. Mozambique, for example, has one engineer for 100,000 people. Africa has the highest proportion of university students studying abroad. Here's a story of two African students in Romania.
Many sub-Saharan African countries have about one or less engineer per 10,000 inhabitants. This is according to the World Bank. The skills gap is especially huge in applied sciences, engineering, and technology. As a result, many African students go abroad for university studies, like Sylvia Ngalema and Raina Slimani, who left their native Central African Republic and Algeria, respectively, to study computer science in Romania. Everything that I learn and acquire here, I will share at home with others. I have learned a lot here. It's more developed and I have more choices. So it would be great to go back home to share with others. But of course, it depends on the opportunities. For years, the Polytechnic University of Bucharest has been offering scholarships to African students to study science courses.
We continue the discussion with the companies, with the many government, and talk about what need to prepare the students for the next years, not for tomorrow, but for many years, because it's necessary to understand what's happened in the real society and real economy. Not now. For the next years.
Africa needs a critical mass of skilled labor, but for that to happen, experts have said the continent will have to invest massively in its universities.
Now, coffee production in Kenya is under threat. Climate change means frequent droughts and irregular rains are drying coffee berries. For most farmers, trying to mitigate these effects is a costly and time-consuming endeavor.
Climate change has led to unpredictable weather patterns that have affected coffee production in most parts of Africa, including Kenya. When coffee plants are exposed to prolonged periods of inadequate rainfall and droughts, the leaves fall off, leaving the plant unproductive and vulnerable to diseases such as mealybugs. Because of climate change, coffee has had many problems. There was prolonged sunlight. The coffee got many diseases. The leaves fell off and the berries did not increase in size. And when the cold weather came, I used a lot of money to buy chemicals because they got diseases. To save their production, farmers have to dig deeper into their pockets for a proper management of the trees. But the returns are uncertain, as erratic weather has affected bean quality. This year's coffee, especially in the month of May, most of it was lightweight. It was not of good grade because it had been affected by prolonged drought in the month of January and February.
Climate change will affect coffee, especially when we have delayed rainfall and increased drought conditions. Like now, the berries will form late when the rainfall is almost ceasing, and those berries will automatically abort because they'll be of lower quality, because they'll have less water. The crop will dry and it will shed leaves, leading to what we call dieback in coffee and losing the entire stems.
Kenya mainly grows Arabica coffee.
And that wraps up this episode of Business Africa with me, Ronald Kato. The news continues on air and online. Bye for now, and I'll see you on the next episode of Business Africa.